All right, Neal Battaglia here, saxstation.com. I want to talk a little bit about language. The tagline on Sax Station right now is actually Speak Saxophone. And you've probably heard some people talk about music as a language. There's a book about that by my friend Susanna. Victor Wooten talks about how learning a language is like learning music. There's a lot of similarities. For me, in terms of language, when I was 15 years old, I started to learn Spanish in school. And I was actually a little bit lucky because my mom speaks a couple of other languages. She speaks Spanish very well, partly because she lived in Chile and South America for 4 years. And so she helped me when I was learning Spanish in school. And actually, kind of a funny story is I took Spanish 1, it didn't seem too hard. I thought I could go ahead and skip to Spanish 3, so not doing Spanish 2. And I did that, but it turned out that that teacher for Spanish 3 was pretty challenging. He was much more challenging than any other language teacher at the school. So I thought I'd be fine. It turned out I was in a little bit of trouble. He would have us do things like write like essays that are a few pages, or at least 1 or 2 pages in Spanish, give a presentation for a few minutes in Spanish. And that's kind of a big jump from Spanish 1. So challenging yourself when you're learning anything, whether it's saxophone, music, or a language, or drawing, or anything like that, is often a really good way to progress and move forward and do the things you want to do with whatever skill you're learning. So getting challenged in this language in Spanish was really helpful for me. And I learned a lot that year. I actually got so I could speak pretty good Spanish at that point, given that I was only learning for 2 years. And after that, I took another year. It was not nearly as challenging the next year, so I learned a little bit, but not as much as I did that 1 year with a really tough teacher who was trying to help us out. And after Spanish, I started learning some German when I was in college, when I was going to Santa Clara. I had a minor actually in the German language, so I took some classes. I studied a lot on my own. When I was working in the summer, I would like be listening to the language and preparing, because I was preparing to go to Germany. I was going to study abroad there. I did that for 2 summers in Heidelberg and Freiburg, 2 different cities, kind of in the southwest part of Germany. Not too far from. I flew into Frankfurt 1 year, and I flew into Stuttgart the other year. So kind of in that area of Germany. And so basically, I studied German quite a bit, and I went to Germany, and jumping in was a great way to learn the language. That was very helpful. I made a lot of mistakes, but I wasn't too hesitant about speaking, and partially because I needed to do that in order to get food, figure out where I was going, do different things. After German, I actually didn't really pick up any new languages for a little while, but about 3 years ago, I started learning Mandarin Chinese. And that language is pretty different than anything I had spoken before. With German, it's pretty similar to English. With Spanish, it's also similar to English in some ways. English kind of has a lot of German roots. It also has a lot of influence from Latin. So it's going to be similar to both Spanish and German in different ways. So I had learned two kind of similar languages, but then I jumped into something that's pretty different. And I actually came up with a game to practice language. Once I kind of had a foundation, I started to play this game where I would like say something in English, I'd have the other person write it down, someone who's learning English, and then I would correct it. And the idea of the game was actually this. It was so that they wouldn't get it completely correct, but they also wouldn't like completely flounder and like get every word wrong, because that's kind of frustrating. So I kind of tell people that the goal is for the other person to get maybe like 70, 80, 90% correct. If it's mostly right, that's cool, but then maybe you can challenge them a little bit more. If it's mostly wrong, then you start adjusting. You make it easier. And I would play this game too. Like someone would say something in Mandarin, Chinese, and I would write it down. And sometimes I would get more than half right. Sometimes I would get most of it right. But still, I play this game to this day because I still find it to be useful. And sometimes it's just super hard, especially if I'm practicing with someone new. It might be that I'll get like 60% right, or even less, maybe like 40%. And at that point, I'll say, well, maybe speak a little slower, or maybe speak a little bit less. It's like hard to pick up what I'm hearing. But yeah, basically, when you're learning a language, you do want to be challenged, just like with music. If you always say what's comfortable, you'll get good at what is comfortable, but you won't necessarily challenge yourself. You won't necessarily progress like you want to. So if you just like played, let's say, like blue bassa all the time, you would have fun with it. It would be comfortable. You wouldn't feel frustrated probably, but you wouldn't necessarily get better at saxophone in the way you want to get. So that's something actually Paul the trombonist was telling me in the, you can check out the interview we did, but he was saying that you always want to challenge yourself. You don't want to make it so it's not fun. You do want to have fun too, but you want to challenge yourself so you get better at what you're doing. So with language, I find it's great to challenge yourself. I did it with Spanish for sure. I forced myself to get in this class, and I got help too from my family. And then with Chinese, I came up with this game, and it can be pretty challenging because I probably speak at about like a 7-year-old level, maybe a 6-year-old, something like that. I mean, more or less in the language. So a lot of things can be pretty difficult, but the challenge is part of what helps you get better at a language, get better at the saxophone. So if you're playing saxophone, one thing you can do is you can like play a song you know, switch to a song you don't know, maybe come back to the song you know, maybe switch to another one, come back, kind of switch it up. Because you can also get things in your short-term memory. In your short-term memory, it feels like you know something, but then the next day you might not remember it. So by kind of like spaced repetition is one phrase to kind of describe this. You can repeat things, but you don't necessarily repeat it like 10 times in a row. Like that can be useful too. It's good to be able to play something correctly like 3 times in a row, but to play something to come back to it later to make sure you know it is going to get it more into the long-term memory, because the short-term memory is a little bit deceptive. It makes you feel like you know it, but you might not know it as well as it seems at that moment. So yeah, think about the challenge. Think about what you can do to make your practicing on saxophone more of a challenge. And also thinking about it as a language, if you've learned a language, can be a good comparison.